In today's Author Spotlight, we welcome Peter Golden, a award-winning journalist, novelist, biographer, and historian. He is here to tell us more about his new book, Wherever There Is Light. Peter, your story chronicles the decades-long love affair between a Jewish immigrant and the granddaughter of a slave. Very interesting that the Jewish immigrant came to the United States and then was down in South Florida as a Caucasian person, of course, and then met a young African-American lady who is going to be basically heiress to a bunch of money.
Right. Well, what happened was in 1935, Hitler fired all the professors. Couldn't get into this country, had immigration problems. You needed someone to say, we'll financially support you, or you needed a job. But it was the Depression. There were no jobs. So the African-American colleges hired hundreds of these Jewish professors, German Jewish professors.
Pretty much brilliant people.
Right, and brought them to the United States to teach. Now, the number one professors like Einstein, and of course, he was wanted all over. Freud had invitations all over the world. These were sort of second tier, brilliant, as he said. These were second tier professors. They got these visas. They came to the United States with their families, which to me was always the interesting part of the story.
And also coming to an African-American college. So then you've got Caucasian people coming to an African-American college in the 30s. What was it like race relations wise back then?
Well, that was an interesting time. I mean, segregation was so strict in those days. They didn't allow African Americans and whites to be buried in the same graveyard, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's a fair amount of conflict in the town once they show up, because the idea of these white families and these white professors living in what was really where African Americans were permitted to live. So that creates the tension in the novel.
Tell us about Julian Rose. He is the professor that came to Florida?
Julian Rose is the son of the professor.
Okay.
Theodore Rose is the professor. Julian Rose is his son, who actually came a little before his parents. He was born in the United States while his father's on a lecture tour. And so he comes and he becomes a gangster, and he makes a fortune during Prohibition, and he's starting to build a real estate empire. But he's still from a sort of a lower income type of family. Now, the daughter, Kendall Wakefield, she comes from an African-American family where her grandfather made a fortune in the catering business in Philadelphia. And he was determined to build a college on the plantation where he'd been born. So he comes back to South Florida after the hurricane, the famous hurricane, where land pennies on the dollar, and buys this plantation. And builds this college that his daughter, Garland, Kendall's mother, runs. Julian and Kendall go through South Florida, then on to Greenwich Village because she wants to be an artist. She ultimately becomes a very famous photographer. And then in post-war Paris, which is kind of interesting. And of course, World War II is part of the book as well.
So the book is based on facts. It's a novel, but based on facts.
Absolutely. I found this book that was basically unreadable, but it had a list inside of it, and I figured out that the woman who wrote it was one of these children who had come. I tried to track her down. This was in the age before the internet. I finally found her in Washington, D.C., called her for a month, no answer. I went down, I sat on the steps of her apartment building. I was curious what happened. A woman comes out, and I asked for her, and she said, oh, I'm sorry, she's been at hospice. She passed away 3 days ago. So I missed her. So I had to sort of research and recreate this situation of where these white professors come to these African-American colleges.
And the book itself takes place in South Florida and a lot in Paris as well.
Yes, South Florida, then on to Greenwich Village and Paris from between 1938 and 1966. I guess I was asking the question, is love really blind? So you'll have to read the book to find out my answer, but that was the question I was
Tell us about the hatred of African Americans, whites, segregation from up north and in South during that period of time.
Well, of course, growing up in the North, one always had this idea that segregation was really a Southern evil. But there was plenty of it in the North. I would like to cite Richard Wright, who was a very famous novelist, very wealthy novelist. In 1940, went to buy a townhouse in Greenwich Village, which was a relatively integrated place, and the bank wouldn't lend him the money to do it. Now, he easily could have afforded to do it. He was certainly qualified. And this was a practice in the North known as redlining. They didn't have signs in the North, but they had practices in the North that pretty much served the same purposes as the signs did in the South.
You're a novelist plus a historian as well, and you've interviewed I don't want to say relatively powerful people, but extremely powerful people, including Gorbachev. You've interviewed Ronald Reagan, a number of other folks, Nixon, Ford,
Yes.
Reagan. What's it like to interview some of the most, at that time, some of the most powerful people in the world, just to sit down and talk?
That's an interesting question, and people have asked me that, and here's what you come away with. A sense of their limits. You know, we sit here, we're watching this controversy now, and we have the idea that a president can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
And what you come away with when they start to look back and talk about their time, what they're really telling you about is how limited their power was and all of the different interests that come to bear on a president. So I think what you come away with is that they're just people who are trying to do their best. That's the thing that you really come away with, is they were trying to do their best. Some did better than others, but I'll leave that to
A couple
everyone.
of seconds left. The most interesting interview you've ever had?
I would say Yitzhak Rabin. It was like interviewing George Washington. He was involved in every aspect of that country, from foot soldier to prime minister.
Wow. You're going to be out tonight at the library. You're going to be at the Library Society, this evening at 6 o'clock, talking with those people,
Yes, I
signing autographed books as well.
Yes, I
Thank
am.
you so much for
Thank you
joining
for
us
having
today.
me.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And we've got more coming up. Ladies, we're talking holiday party dresses with the friends from Apricot Lane. Don't go away.